you. Good evening. I'm Anne Keary. I'm a lecturer with the Faculty of Education, Monash University, and President of the Australian Council of TESOL Associations, known as ACTA. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's online event hosted by the Faculty of Education, Monash University. Before we start, we're just going to do a quick poll to find out the areas of interest of those who are with us tonight. Okay, so we can see that we've got great interest in TESOL and LOTE. Some of the audience, applied linguistics, English, literacy and linguistics, all represented this evening. So I'd like to acknowledge that Associate Professor Graham Parr, Faculty of Education, Monash, Professor Ben Rampton and Dr. Melanie Cook, King's College, United Kingdom, have been of great assistance setting up this online event. Ben and Mel are collaborating with the Faculty of Education, Monash University, in the Dean's Distinguished Scholar Program. So this evening, I'm joined by Dr. Michael Michel, former President of ACTA, who along with Dr. Helen Moore, the ACTA TESOL President, led the work on the ACTA National Schools Roadmap for EALD education. And a very warm welcome to Professor Constance Leung, a Professor of Educational Linguistics, King's College, London, who has joined us tonight as a discussant. So the Australian Council of TESOL Associations is the peak body for TESOL in Australia. As a national association, it's made up of state and territory associations. It advocates for and enhances the profile of the TESOL profession in Australia through a range of activities at local, state, national and international levels. ACTA has been extremely concerned that a national education policy in the area of EALD education has been neglected for the past 2 decades. The roadmap is in response to this policy neglect. It sets out a national program for EALD learners going forward. Michael will talk more about the background to and urgent need for such a roadmap, and then Constant will provide a reply to Michael's briefing, giving a UK perspective of issues of EALD education in schools. Following on from these presentations, we'll have a Q&A session. Please put your questions in the chat box. In the first instance, we'll reply to the questions in the chat box, and these questions will be facilitated. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Anne. Evening, everyone. My role tonight's just to give a bit of a context to the policy, education policy relating to the National EALD Roadmap, and give a bit of an overview of that roadmap. You may have read it from cover to cover or skimmed through it, but I'll touch on some of the actions there that are particularly relevant for us tonight. Afterwards, when we come to Q&A session, Anne and Helen will be assisting in the responses there as well, so as part of the panel. Australia used to have a national system of English language support for schools. Some of you will be old enough to remember that, perhaps. I was. We had a specific purpose program with a identified equity target group. There was tied funding, and there was some sort of transparent accountability for the use of that funding. That all sort of disappeared really on the turn of the century, and it all was underpinned by, the responsibility for that was underpinned at the Commonwealth level because of the Commonwealth's responsibility for immigration. So that's gone really by the wayside in the last 2 decades. And there are 2 kind of broad themes, I think, that have contributed to the demise of the EALD in these 2 decades. First being that the student group, the equity group, has sort of become invisible. So English language learners have really disappeared from the policy discourse. In particular, the 2 schooling declarations, the Melbourne 2008 declaration in the Alice Springs 2019 declaration, they've gone missing as an equity cohort within that. And what that means is that the English language learners are just not a priority at the national level. And that has a number of related effects. The very big one being that they're not identified within that plan. They're not reported in any way, shape or form in any national reporting. And when it comes to policy reviews, they're completely ignored actually in the thinking. So perhaps an example there most recently is the Quality Initial Teacher Education Review report, which just paid no attention whatsoever to the 600,000 English language learners in Australia and the implications of that for teacher education and teacher standards. So that's kind of really a major structural issue in terms of the lack in the omissions in policy. A second policy impact on ELD has been the devolution of a responsibility for ELD from the Commonwealth to states and territory education systems, and in turn, devolution of that responsibility from state and territory education systems to schools and teachers. So you're getting a sort of cascading of shifting responsibility and accountability. We could even call it buck passing from the Commonwealth to the state to the school level. So it's not surprising then with that process and the emphasis in particularly last 10 years on school autonomy and expanding decision making at the school level by principals and school leaders, that there's been a major erosion and diversion of ELD resources, what there is, which doesn't necessarily reach the target group as we've known them. So the earmarked funding which we do have, or that is available under Gonski, which is the low English proficiency funding, is not necessarily reaching the students. It's not tied funding, it's flexible funding, and so it's used flexibly at the school level and even at the system level. Other impacts we see is related to that is casualisation of ELD teachers and out of area ELD teaching. So teachers who are not trained ELD taking up ELD positions and so on. And that's all getting a whole lot worse now with the acute teacher shortages we're seeing before us now. There's been, at the same time, there's been a downsizing of or even abolition of system professional support within education systems as we used to have it. And then there's this sort of deregulation of ELD teacher accreditation at the state level, where there's reduced incentive or demand for pre-service and post-grad TESOL training. So it's probably worth saying the Gonski funding system is actually been an enabler of this erosion. Even though there is a loading specifically for English language proficiency, as I mentioned, it's not tied, and it's even not related to actual students, strangely enough. It's the only loading that where there's a loading for some need, but the students are not even kind of mentioned or talked about as a target group. And there's been, unsurprisingly, a complete lack of accountability and transparency in the use of that funding. And there's been a number of reports at the national level for 4 or so auditors general reports and parliamentary reports on the lack of transparency for the Gonski funding. And there's been a very significant one in New South Wales about Gonski funding, equity funding not reaching students and not being able to be tracked and even identify what the outcomes of that are for students. So COVID's made everything, this is all happening before COVID, and COVID's made everything a whole lot worse. It's within COVID, it's been talked about there's been a digital divide that's opened up, but in case of English language learners, there's been an English language divide that's opened up, because those students in those schools and areas which have had the harshest and longest lockdowns, the environment for English language learning has been completely, well, very substantially reduced, and that affects both the oral language development, the sort of the BICS, basic interpersonal communication, and as well as the academic language learning in the more formal sense. So there's a kind of double whammy there in terms of the disruption to English language learning for these students in schools. And as we're seeing now with the sort of rolling COVID sicknesses and so forth, and the disruption in schools, that's still a kind of issue. So there's really a complete disconnect between the reality of the demographic reality of English language learners in schools, and many schools, the majority of students are actually English language learners, bumping up against literacy ceilings without appropriate support, for example, and the reality of that versus the lack of any policy infrastructure to deal with that, and the neglect and the void that we've seen seen the last two decades. So that's kind of the background to the roadmap and why we felt, as Anne said, we've been worried about this for some time. We surveyed teachers in schools some years back, and we found a lot of the erosion was taking place. So it was really a case of now of trying to put together a kind of rescue plan for EALD, and I think we see it as a kind of bit of a last chance rescue plan to reverse the damage and to build back better at the national level for English language, the ELD provision. So the roadmap's got, as you might have seen, 12 policy problems and 12 policy solutions broadly that cover really all the key areas that impact on ELD programs and provision. And what we've done in the roadmap is to link each of these to very as closely as we can to the National Schools Reform Agreement, the current one, which has the three kind of directions, which related to supporting students, student learning and student achievement. There are 4 actions there. Supporting teaching, school leadership and school improvement. There's 5 actions there, and enhancing the national evidence base. There's three actions there. So the ones that probably of a particular concern and interest to people tonight might be the ones relating to the middle section, the teachers supporting teaching, school leadership and school improvement, which is actions 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. So action 5 is about equipping all pre-service teachers to teach ELD learners. And the issue is there is the adequacy of that in the ELD content in ELD course in ITE courses. And the mapping that we've done around that has highlighted some major weaknesses, particularly in school in those courses where there's a focus on, say, broadly diversity or inclusivity, but really lack substantive ELD content in terms of language, second language acquisition, language demands of curriculum and so on. Action 6 is about strengthening specialist TESOL courses, and the survey or the mapping we did of that highlighted weaknesses for both at the pre-service level, but also at the post-service level, post-grad level, in relation to the linking of a lot of those courses to the international student market. Some of those courses disappeared with the loss of that market, And I think there's also been a loss in some cases of the school perspective within those courses because of that linking. Action 7 is about rebuilding professional learning, leadership and school development. We know, that school leaders and principals are absolutely key to decision makers as to whether ELD programs happen and how they happen. Unfortunately, what we find is there's not the knowledge base from many of those leaders to actually make good decisions about the ELD programs in schools. So action 7 is about building up the expertise and the knowledge in that for those people within schools. Action 8 is becoming quite acute now, is the workforce planning. And what we, the general issues for all teachers and specialist teachers, the issues of supply of, shortage of teachers in the regions is now an issue of shortage of teachers in urban areas in Australia. And it's becoming acute also for ELD teachers. And yet, even though state governments are now scrambling to have their own, implement their own teacher supply strategies, ELD teachers are not specified as an area within that, unfortunately. We yet to see that. So, and action 9 is an action that relates to research. And I guess this is an opportunity here to think about how we need to develop ELD pedagogy nationally and within state and territory jurisdictions. Post-COVID, it's not a matter of just going back to normal. We need to think about perhaps pedagogies of acceleration, and certainly not defaulting to kind of pedagogies of remediation, which is a trend that can take place. So there's some possibilities there that we need to explore with at university level and possibly with the Australian Education Research Organisation. So there are a number of things you can do. My voice is giving out at the moment, so I might stop there and we can sort of talk about some of the things that university and academics can undertake to for further advocacy around this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We might hand over to Constant now to reply. And thank you, Constant.
Thank you, and thank you, Michael. Let me just say immediately that congratulations for putting together such a document. Almost every clause in that document is directly relevant to the issues that we are facing very much in the UK and certainly in England. And I dare say particularly in England. The UK context is slightly complex in that Scotland has its own educational policy and administration, and Wales, as you know, is a bilingual country now with Welsh and English, and so there's the discussion on bi and multilingualism within education and so on, and Northern Ireland has its own educational jurisdiction. So in the main, what I'm going to say now in the next few minutes is primarily a reflection of my experience of having worked in England most of the time. Of course, in contact with colleagues everywhere within the UK, and indeed with you guys over the last 3 decades or so. And what I have to say though is not actually anything specific about the roadmap, because I think almost every bit is needed. So from my point of view, as someone working outside Australia, I'd like to make three, if you like, points. They are points at some level of abstraction, but nevertheless, I hope they bear on the actual implementation or further consideration of how to set about making the roadmap sort of pedagogically and in curriculum terms, perhaps more workable. That's not saying that, you know, anything you say is not workable. I'm saying is I'm drawing from my experience of working in the UK and reflect on some of the ideas that you have, which are very good. But don't let me waste any more time on sort of, you know, general comments. The first point I want to make is in any kind of implementation of educational reform or improvement, very often there is a kind of presumption, if you like, that how things should be done and who should be the lead actors involved. Now, using a very particular episode within the English education system, going back 15 years or so, to illustrate what I mean by that, and some of the things that, sorry,
I think we've just lost you temporarily, Constant.
Oh, am I back?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah, tell me every time I sort of disappear. Okay. There was such a thing called the literacy strategy for schools, and what this meant, what this was essentially a response to some kind of policy panic that the school system wasn't producing students benchmark appropriate to their ages. And there was, you know, some sort of, if you like, testing system that indicated that, you know, goodish percentage, you know, 50% or so of the age cohort not performing up to standard, however that was defined. So in came a policy called the National Strategy for Literacy and Numeracy, and I'm going to talk about the literacy part, okay? And what this meant was
Constant, we're having a couple of issues with the technology, just in terms of the streaming. It might be easier if we turn the video off, just to see if we can conserve a little bit of bandwidth and see how that goes. Yeah. My apologies.
No, not at all. Maybe I should turn my camera off too, just in case. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that might work.
Michael, would you like to pick up while Constant is?
Yeah, I was just thinking the literacy hegemony and displacement of EALD. We've been there in the late 90s and early noughties. Literacy was the sort of dominant, still is in many places, the dominant frame for thinking about the issues that have subsumed EALD and brought with it a sort of monolingual kind of focus to it, both at early childhood level and onwards in school. So it's another one of those areas. I guess I didn't mention it because it's now kind of, so it's in the first decade of the century that has affected policy. But you know, within that, there's been these further displacements that have come on top of that as well.
Okay, maybe we could take some questions while we're waiting for Constant to come back on.
And I think that Constant is back now.
Okay, thank you, Constant.
Sorry about that. I'm sorry. So I'll go as fast as I can, so to avoid any further disruptions. Anyway, this idea of the literacy strategy was compulsory. So every school in England had to have 1 hour a day in the school day devoted to literacy teaching, and the curriculum itself was set by the central authorities. The initial idea, as far as I know, came from a body of work that you guys would be very familiar with, genre theory. But by the time it kind of got recontextualized and sort of exported to England, it became a kind of lockstep program whereby in this 1 hour of school time, the teacher would be told to use the first 15 minutes in whole class teaching some content to do with, for example, using phonics or some other aspects of lexical grammar. And then another 15 minutes on, combined work exercise, and then another, 10, 15 minutes on individual work and with, a rigid time division with the content prescribed. And this, I'm not talking about a success or failure yet, but what this meant was it deprived teachers any say in the matter, and the schools themselves had no choice but to follow, this division of time, sometimes at the expense of other subject areas and so on. And this also had a kind of, as it were, de-skilling.
Michael, I think you're back on. Sorry, I think we've lost Constant again.
Maybe we could take it to Russell Cross, has made a comment here. Russell, would you like to speak to your comment? If that's possible.
Thanks, Anne. I'll keep the video off because I don't want to mess up bandwidth anymore. But hopefully the comment makes sense. But I think that's the idea. But first of all, I've just got to say congratulations again to ACTA for taking the leadership here and championing this. I think, as Michael said, it's a bit of a rescue plan, but someone and some groups had to stand in and do it. And I think that really does need to be celebrated. So congratulations on that and all the affiliates who've fed into it. But I also take all of the points that have just been made about, not wanting to get trapped within the literacy frame and the problems that we've had in the past for that. But I also think the real value and the knowledge that our EAL specialists are bringing to the field is challenging what, a monolingual kind of centric, untroubled notion of literacy in the first place. And I think, precisely what Helen said, the idea that literacy is a monolingual kind of construct and taking that into the education system and expecting bilingual, multilingual, plurilingual students to play that game is one that's just losing policy relevance. And I think I didn't, this may be my misinterpretation, having had a chance to read the roadmap in full. I know from the people who are involved that way of thinking is very strong. I'm not sure I felt it come through as powerfully as it might have in the roadmap, but yeah, the only reason I raise that now is because, as Constance says, as I think Michael was hinting at, literacy is not our friend so long as it remains stuck in a monolingual kind of framing of what literacy is. But I think that's really where our TESOL specialists bring the knowledge that we do need moving forward. We can't continue to teach running records and miscue analysis like we used to in the past, when we now know the majority of students who come into entry have a language background other than English. We can't continue to think of literacy as if they only have one language. Sorry, that's all. I hope it made sense. So.
Thanks, Russell. Michael, did you want to say anything? Or?
Just a thought that occurred to me is that that literacy intervention approach was kind of like a zero tolerance kind of approach, which imposed a solution, which is kind of contradictory to what we've seen in the last 10 years around kind of basically laissez-faire school autonomy kind of policy. So, which is, the teachers know best, the school knows best, the principal knows best. So just let them work it out, sort of thing. So it's kind of there's these contradictory forces in policy that I guess highlight the Tweedledum and Tweedledee kind of approach to it as well.
Thank you. Graham, did you want to comment about the genre approach? Yes, Graham.
Thanks. And I was just being a little bit provocative, and it's a little bit of a side issue. I think it actually would be better for us to pursue this question of the hegemony of literacy. I think that's a really important idea that's been raised, and Russell, you're wondering whether the point came across really clearly. It did indeed, and I think it's yeah, I'd much prefer that I didn't derail the conversation by talking about genre theory as much as I have passionate feelings about it.
Okay. Kay Whedon. Sorry, I don't know.
That's Kirk, I think.
Kurt, would you like to make a comment or a question?
We've got Sean the sheep in the background here, so forgive me. Yeah, I was just interested in the hegemony of literacy. I've never come across this term, but in schools, the EAL team that I was part of in one high school really struggled to articulate their own place in the school. You know, there was this idea that we're all doing literacy, and you know, it's all about language, and so it seems as though is that what we mean by the hegemony of literacy, and how do we articulate that difference to administrators and teachers?
Yes, I think that's a great example of the hegemony at work. The literacy kind of covers all that and supposedly addresses all those problems. So yeah, it's definitely, that's the hegemony at work for sure.
Okay.
If I could chime in here as well. It's Jen Alford here. Hello, everyone. Just about the hegemony of literacy, I think I agree with Russell that it is an issue, and it is changing, but I wonder whether some of this is to do with the fact that many EALD teachers, as brilliant as we are monolingual ourselves, myself included. So largely monolingual, mostly monolingual. So, you know, we're part of the problem. So the more we can diversify the workforce, the more chance we have of breaking down that hegemony, I think. Just a thought.
Thank you, Jennifer. Helen, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think the hegemony is also, if you like, to take up Russell's point, multifaceted. It works at different levels. So that in schools, I think teachers, it's just a confusion about a lack of direction. I mean, what I'm thinking about is the evidence that I gave to the parliamentary inquiry into adult literacy late last year. And I said to them, if you could do one thing, could you please distinguish literacy from learning another language? And they said, oh, why? In other words, it was just complete ignorance at that political level. And it's really easy at that political level to talk about literacy and think you're covering everything. Whereas if you go down a bit further, those of you who are around in the 80s and 90s, like there was, at least in some spheres, an attempt to appropriate EALD concerns by literacy educators, partly I think because, well, especially in the adult literacy field, because the adult literacy was so underfunded and so relegated. And when our former friend Mr. Dawkins came along and thought that he could make a play about talking about literacy, and we've had it over and over again that, you know, about every 8 years there's a literacy scare. The literacy people and EALD people also thought, well, if there, you know, there's an initiative around literacy, we might as well get on the bandwagon, never mind what we call it. So I think this idea of the hegemony of literacy plays out in different ways at different levels with different kinds of politics.
Thank you, Helen. May French, would you like to make a comment?
Thank you. I'm not sure how well prepared I am to comment. I've come in late and just listening to the discussion, but you know, the comment about so many EALD teachers being monolingual, I think that there's sort of been this historical expectation, and it's not only in Australia, that teachers of English are so-called native speakers or monolingual English speakers, and there's a bit of a legacy of that in the workforce, I suppose. And changing who becomes an EALD teacher is more than just trying to encourage more diversity sort of through recruitment or through recruitment into teacher education, but also expectations in different sectors of the community about what counts as speaking English, I suppose.
Okay, thank you, May. Margaret Turnbull, would you like to comment on the National Assessment Program?
Oh, just what people are aware of, and I'm sure this is an international issue as well, that when we've got the NAPLAN, the National Literacy Assessment and Numeracy, it's driven by an agenda to standardise writing. And I know they're in the process at a national level of revising the writing assessment and reviewing NAPLAN, but I can't see it disappearing anytime soon because there's just too much emphasis placed on the data that we get from NAPLAN as a tool for what is seen nationally as a tool for evaluating the impact of various initiatives. And while NAPLAN is used nationally as a tool for evaluating impact of programs, EAL and EALD students are kind of invisible in that. It's a real catch-22 because the data that we get is just, you know, not giving any relevant information about EALD learners. So huge issues surrounding NAPLAN assessment from my perspective.
Thanks, Margaret. And Anna, maybe you'd like to comment on the land type and literacy.
Oh, look, don't get me started. Yeah, I think it's another very important aspect, because we do talk about pre-service teacher educators, and we do talk about the workforce that's already jumping through specific hurdles and loops to get to the stage where they have to demonstrate they belong to the top 30 literate% of the Australian population. What does it mean? How this test is put together? I know my colleague Kitty is here. We've been talking about it. Russell is part of the conversation as well about what exactly it is, what is a literate teacher and what is a teacher who can be a good EAL teacher. And I am a bilingual speaker, and I consider myself to be a very good English teacher, and I'm proud of it. Yeah, I think just thank you so much for putting this document together and having this conversation. It's so important. Thank you. Thank you, Anna.
We've got Constant back. I might just let him draw breath for a minute or two to get back into the conversation. And Russell, I believe you'd like to make a follow-up comment about Jennifer's contribution.
Just a super brief one, and it flows on well, I think, with the point that Anna just made about sociolinguistic profiles. You know, I think Jennifer said part of the problem is maybe the demographic and diversity of teachers, but I also think there's so much value in having monolingual teachers, absolute value in having them, in the same way when we think about, for example, LGBTI allies, and that otherwise it becomes divisive. It's about who can and who can't, and I don't think that's a very helpful way to be going forward. But as you know, Jennifer and others demonstrate, you can be maybe identify monolingually or whatever, or see that as your predominant social linguistic profile, for example, but still be deeply, deeply aware and sensitive to what it means to be a plurilingual learner. So I think, and that's much more valuable than having divisiveness. So I think all I'd say is, yeah, let's just celebrate that as much as the idea that one could possibly either be better or worse than the other. And I know that's not Jennifer's point at all. But I just think, I just heard her say, you know, part of that problem is, you know, about questioning the diversity, but, you know, as Jennifer and others have demonstrated, being allies is even more valuable than necessarily having that diversity yourself. It's being able to work with others. So that's the only point I'd make in follow up to that.
Okay, thanks, Russell. I'd just like to give a plug at this stage for the Early Childhood Education Consultancy Group for ACTA, who are also putting together a document, an Early Childhood Manifesto for home language-based EALD education. We've got a very culturally and linguistically diverse workforce in the early childhood sector, very low paid. There's issues about qualifications and career pathways, a very gendered workforce. And are we valuing and drawing on the rich linguistic resource that many of these teachers with certificates or diplomas, some with degrees, have in this early childhood space? You know, we have very few bilingual programs left within Victoria for early childhood education. And we have got a very diverse workforce, yet we don't draw on the rich linguistic resource that they bring with them to the workplace. Constant, would you like to come in at this point to make any further comment?
No, I'm trying to catch up on the discussion, but you know, I understand, you know, the right at this moment, looks like there are so many things that would be needed. I have a question actually. Is there a kind of priority there? Which bit should come first? I mean, of all the actions that you're requiring, where would you see as the kind of the starting point? I mean, you know, presumably you can't do everything.
Good question, Constant. Yes, I think we find ourselves gravitating towards action number 10, which is implement a nationally agreed measure and method of reporting English language proficiency. Because without that, we don't actually have a nationally identified target group, and without the target group, we've got nothing. We're where we are at the moment. So it's it becomes a data kind of thing, and this has been a kind of the process did start, but it got interrupted, and it's in a state of kind of arrested development at the moment. I think in some quarters it was seen as an important area, but really the promise of Gonskill has not been fulfilled, because there was, I think, an initial objective of actually providing some kind of way of identifying ELD learners in terms of their English language skills. So, you know, as long as that is not cemented and not formed, we're still in a kind of policy no man's land, where it's just whatever's going on in schools, and whatever state and territory systems kind of develop in terms of supporting students that they identify as needing support. So that that would be the one, the one from which a lot of other things flow. Because if you're talking about, for example, resourcing, then you've got a link that's linked to, you know, needs, identification of needs, and so on. So that has an implication there, and so on. So yeah, that would be my answer there.
Thank you. Constant, would you like to say anything else?
Point? Yes, I mean, I think certainly in any kind of policy-led reform, having some clear indications of where resources should go would be a very good thing, and that invariably in relation to EALD would be about some indications of proficiency and the needs of the learners in relation to what the school system, what the education system expects, and so on. So yeah, and I think, you know, it's for that reason that I think you know, I sort of mentioned the need to look at a model of proficiency, so that it's not itself either overestimating or underestimating or being irrelevant to actually what's going on in school. So the kind of language proficiency that we're talking about increasingly would need to be a little bit more non-Anglo-centric, if you like, taking account of the, our increasing understanding of flexible multilingualism and the presence of other languages within individual students' language repertoires, and how that may be brought to the fore and recognized as part of, the and both potentials and attainments already, in place. And so that needs to be looked at, I think, as a matter of urgency. If any kind of action is going to go forward, it would give us very sound basis for further action. If nothing else, simply to really understand, what linguistic capital we have in our school population is a very good thing, So yeah, I agree with you, and it's a key area, and there's quite a bit of interesting work in this area now. The old monolingual English native speaker thing has been, I think, effectively kind of broken. That's that model. Okay. And I don't know how far you guys follow this CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. Well, in the 2020 iteration, the companion volume, they removed all the mention, literally the words native speaker out as their kind of reference point. So we are probably in reasonably good place to do that sort of work now.
Thank you, Constant. We've got a follow-up question from Russell. Russell, would you like to direct it towards Helen?
Oh yeah, to Helen or the ACTA panel in general. I just know there's been a lot of work that she and others have been doing around reinvigorating the AMEP program, what that means for TESOL, the parliamentary inquiry into adult literacy. So I'm just interested to what extent ACTA sees that being the roadmap, having a relationship to that work, or maybe it doesn't. I just found it really interesting.
We also have an incipient adult ESL working group. The problem with making direct connections is that what happens in the AMEP is very particular to the AMEP and hinges around the actual contracts that providers are asked to bid for. And what's hanging in the balance right at the minute is a request for tenders that was developed under the last government, which was, if you want something that's totally monolingual, you can't get better than that, in the sense that 20% of provider payments was to rest on results. And the results are determined in terms of the overall TAFE system and a competency-based framework. So if you wanted to sort of tease it out a bit more, I think where the intersection is in this incredibly narrow definition of what constitutes outcomes, both in the school system and in the adult sector. The problem in the adult sector, it's like you could call it the canary down the mine, or it's the worst possible scenario where AMEP providers are required to teach to an accredited curriculum in the vocational education training system, and the way in which those specifications are set up are extraordinarily narrow and totally monolingual, not only monolingual in their orientation, but mechanistic in their orientation. They're about as bad as you could possibly think. So in the advocacy work that we've been doing, we're directing our attention, if we can, to getting the ear of the incoming minister and saying, please stop this request for tender. So it's a very narrowly focused endeavour, but interesting question, Russell. There is an overlap, and I think the key to the overlap is how outcomes are conceptualised and operationalised.
The roadmap's focused fairly firmly around schools, but there is one action within that where there is this intersection between school and post-school, and that's action 4. And in that area of both students whose attachment to school at the senior school it was quite weak anyway because of their age at which they came to Australia and so on, or who've dismissed school altogether and so are relying on other kind of programs to develop English language and literacy skills. So it's that's the one where there's most intersection, and in that space there has been AMEP have done some work. There have been other sort of post-type school programs where there's been some work and some models, but there tends to be kind of projects that are here today and gone tomorrow, and that's the problem, is that transition from school to post-school is a very fraught one, and there isn't the support that's needed there for students, also Indigenous students within school. So that's what that action's about, is kind of strengthening that intersection and that transition in that process. So that I kind of draw your attention to that one in that one, that action itself.
So thank you, Michael. We'll have to draw the online event to a close now, but I'd really like to thank Constant Leung from King's College, UK. Sorry you were floating in and out there for a little bit, Constant, but you managed to rejoin the conversation. And Michael Michelle and Helen Moore from ACTA. And Russell has said, can we end on a positive note? Well, I think the positive note is that we have begun a conversation, and we've begun a conversation at national level and at international level as well. And we hope that we can keep this conversation going and continue advocacy in the field.
Can I end on a positive note too? I think what's important is to find the policy structure to which ELD needs to attach itself and to speak to. And in this, this has been kind of the hard part of working out, what is this roadmap? Is it just a bunch of stuff that we want to happen for ELD? Nobody's interested if that's all it is. What's important, I think, is that this agenda is tied to that larger agenda of national schools reform. And that's a reform that's coming down the tracks now, because discussions are already starting for the 2024 quadrennium, right? And we need to get on that bus, because we haven't been on that bus, and we need to. And that's what this roadmap's about, is getting on that bus. So just on that, there's the Productivity Commission is conducting an inquiry into the next National Schools Reform Agreement to be signed by all and sundry in 2024. Unfortunately, the submission's closed tomorrow. ACTA's putting together a submission for that, but there will be discussions going forward from when that report is released at the end of the year there'll be discussions happening with each of the state and territory systems and presumably interest groups this year and next year. So I'd encourage you to kind of look out for that and can contribute to that to make sure that ELD is on that bus, as it were. Okay, so thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you for all those who have registered who may watch this recording in the future. And as we say, please look at the ACTA website, which has a lot of advocacy information about the adult sector, school sector, and the Early Childhood Manifesto will be released in the next few months, we hope. All right, thank you. Thank you.